thank you everyone for being here in the second day afternoon. It's a long second day, but I hope we can raise your attention with a couple of interesting new things on young people. We will speak about young people today, and it is an issue always, right? We live in a time in a multiple crisis. We live in a time where we absolutely have no idea how we will live in 10 years from now. It's really very specific time in our life, and I think 30 years ago we had an idea about what the future would be. Today we really don't know. So we are learning, we are thinking, we are discussing, we are experimenting all the time in order to figure out how to get through the lots of crises we are living in, and of course to maintain a good life. Moreover, there is war, so there are things which really don't know, and the word we are planning and experimenting is for a generation that comes after us, who are the young people. So it's our responsibility also to learn and understand how they live, how they grew, because there's only one thing what we know, that we have to prepare our kids. I have 3 kids in their late 10s and 20s. So also as a parent and the society, what we have to do is to prepare them for something where they have to be resilient, they have to adapt, and they have to change all the time, and we really don't know how to do this, right? So we have to teach them for something which we don't know what it is. So actually it's very interesting to learn about how young people live and what do they think of the world and what they are ready for. So this is why I'm super happy to be here today with you, and also the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, which made a fascinating big report in the whole region of Central and Eastern Europe and the Baltic states, comparative report. Many of the country reports you can find around yourself, and have with us the authors of this report and also 2 commentators from the region. So I'd like to introduce you our speakers today. First of all, I'd like to show you Elena Avramovska, who was a chief researcher who put together this series of studies, and also András Bíró-Nagy, who is director of the Policy Solutions Institute from Hungary, who was a contributor to the report. Elena is from the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. And we also have 2 politicians with us, young politicians. Well, I was a young politician, and we are always supposed to speak about young people until we are young, so somehow people think that young people should speak about young people. But anyway, it's very nice to have you both, and I practiced Agnieszka's name, Agnieszka Dziemianowicz-Bąk, something like this, right? Thank you very much. And Olga Richterová from the Czech Republic, and Agnieszka is from Poland, and András is from Hungary. So we also have a nice representation of the region among our speakers. But first of all, I would like to give the floor to Elena. And I would like to ask you to say a couple of words about what this report, about what are the key findings, especially the ones that you were surprised.
Thank you so much, Zsuzsa, and it's really a great pleasure to be here at the Budapest Forum. So yes, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung has been doing youth studies for the last couple of years, and right now we are finalizing our biggest study, comparative one, on Central Europe and the Baltics. As you can see, we have also country-specific studies on the countries in the region. And we have quite a few striking findings. And this is very interesting and an important report, I would say, because it's about region that is changing fast. And at the same time, it's still certain legacies of the Soviet past are still present and evident in our report. It's also a region that in the last years have experienced democratic backsliding in many of the countries, and it's the fastest shrinking region in terms of population across the world, and the proportion of young people living in the country is really becoming smaller and smaller. There is a high number of immigration and brain drain in the region, and it's very important to understand what young people people across Central Eastern Europe and the Baltics think and feel about democracy and how we can address this democratic deficit. So to start on a little bit of a positive note, it's important to say that they feel quite positive about their own personal future, but they are very much negative about the future of their countries. And this is interesting. So probably being young means being a little bit positive about yourself, but they're indeed very pessimistic about the future of their countries. And they are primarily concerned, when we ask them about what are their biggest fears and concerns about the future, they say that unemployment, low wages, and low pensions are their biggest worries, which is kind of surprising for this demographic to be worried so much about low pensions already. And similar studies across different regions in the world, for example, in Western Europe, in Germany, in France, when we ask what young people worry about, they would often point out they worry about climate change and the environment. So it seems really that materialistic concerns are shaping this region much more than post-materialistic concerns such as the climate and the environment. And then we also find some striking examples in terms of their support for democracy. So we often assume that young people, by definition, should be very supportive of democracy. And we can say that, yes, the majority would say that democracy is a better form of government than any other. However, every fifth person would say that under certain circumstances, dictatorship would be a better form of government than democracy, and every 10th person categorically rejects democracy. And this is quite worrying coming from this demographic, which, by the way, is between the age of 15 and 29. And they're also very distrustful of their national institutions, are extremely distrustful of their of the political parties in their countries. They trust the police, they trust the judiciary, especially in the Baltic states, but not across the board. And they're very much pro-European and very trustful of NATO. So they trust international institutions, but they're really distrustful of their national governments, of the political parties. And this is also evident in the way that they don't like to participate so much in political life. They categorically reject having to do anything with politics, especially those from Central Europe. In the Baltics, they're a bit more interested in politics, but those in Central Europe, they're like, okay, we don't want to do anything with politics, we don't want to participate in political decision-making, and they feel that actually the current government do not care about this demographic, that the policies that the governments are making are not for them, and they're not interested in those. So I would stop here. This is like setting the scene. I hope it's not very negative, although our findings are sometimes surprisingly negative. And yes, and then we can continue sharing more insights as we go on.
Thank you very much for the quick snapshot. And I would like to ask András now to go on probably more in details on Hungary. You have all microphones, so can you please take your personal mic? Yes, wonderful.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind invitation. Actually, it was a pleasure to participate in such an ambitious project on youth research. I have to tell you that it's a rare opportunity in Central and Eastern Europe to have the opportunity to participate in such an in-depth research on so many countries with the same methodology at the same time. And what happened here is that we had the opportunity to do this representative research on young people at the same time last year in 7 countries. And as it was mentioned, the final comparative report will be out in 2 weeks' time, but you can already see the country reports. I'm one of the authors of the Hungary country report, and I also contributed to the Central and Eastern European comparative one. When we have a look at the results, I think that we can have mixed feelings, so that we can, of course, see some negative trends and some worrying trends, but at the same time, there are reasons to be hopeful, and I will tell now a few examples for both reasons. Let's start with the negative side. I believe that one of the most striking things, not only about Hungary, but also about many other countries in the region, is that how apolitical the young people are. I just tell you a concrete number from the V4. Actually, 50% of young people in Visegrad countries feel that they are not represented by the political elite, and it's in the single digits, the share of those who think that they are well represented by the political elite. The interest in politics is extremely low in Hungary compared to the other V4 countries, but the average result for the V4 is also pretty low. This already suggests what the point is about Hungary, is that the Hungarian youth is the most disappointed and the most disillusioned with the political regime, not only with the Orbán regime, but with how politics works in general in the entire region, while at the same time, I have to tell you, it was quite a surprising result that the Polish youngsters seem to be the most active politically in the region, not necessarily in terms of electoral participation, but when it comes to political participation beyond elections, civic activism or demonstrations and so on. So that was kind of a surprisingly positive result about Poland. But regarding interest in politics, just to give you a flavor of how Hungarian youngsters think about politics, only 22% of Hungarian youngsters said that they were interested in politics, while 50% of them said that they are not interested in politics. And beyond the low interest in politics, what I would also highlight is the low trust in political parties, low trust in government, as well low trust in how democracy works, especially in Hungary. And maybe just one more worrying trend, and this is the high willingness of emigration in the region. And it's also especially true for the Polish youngsters and the Hungarian ones. And what is absolutely striking, and probably this was one of the most surprising things in the Hungary research, was the extreme polarization already at such young age, which was not something typical of the other V4 countries, so not at that level at least. But in terms of the Hungarian youngsters, what we saw, and this was striking when it comes to emigration especially, is that 3 times more opposition voter youngsters said that they are willing to leave the country on the long term than Fidesz voter youngsters. The concrete numbers were 12% for the Fidesz voters and 36% for the opposition voters, which shows that it really has to do something with how they see democracy working in practice and the Orbán regime working in practice in Hungary. Another point that I would probably highlight when it comes to this regional comparative research, but again, especially on Hungary, is that the general dissatisfaction with everything, basically, with education, with how democracy works, with politics, with parties, and also with the economic situation of their families. So if we take this general dissatisfaction into account, then it's probably surprising that it's not translated into activity, but it's rather translated into passivity. So dissatisfaction, especially in the Hungarian context, goes together with some kind of passivity. And as I mentioned, the Hungarian youngsters especially do not protest or do not choose resistance when it comes to their dissatisfaction, but they rather choose the strategy of exit, so that they potentially leave the country if they are really, really fed up with the system, or they're really fed up with the lack of opportunities in their lives. Passive youth, actually, I believe, is quite good news for the Orbán regime. And the reason why I'm saying this is because the young voters are heavily underrepresented among Orbán supporters and Fidesz voters, because this is actually one of the major trends, demographic trends in terms of party preferences over the last decade, since 2010, that the Fidesz voting base became older than ever, rural than ever, and it has more support among lower educated segments of the society, and this also means that it's less popular among the higher educated and also the urban people and the young people. So if disappointed young people choose not to protest and not to participate, then it means that this is the perfect result for the current regime in Hungary. And I actually always thought that Poland is in a much better situation than Hungary, from many perspectives, from many aspects. Also that I believe that in Poland the civil society is much stronger than here in Hungary. Also the media that is independent from the regime is much stronger in Poland than in Hungary. And also for me it seems that the Polish youth is much more active and much more willing to do something for their own future than the Hungarian youngsters. One of the most striking results about the Polish youth for me was that it proved to be the most tolerant and the less nationalistic youth segment in the entire region. So in Poland, I believe there is much more hope for an active, more tolerant young movement than in Hungary currently. And to say a few words about hope, so on the positive side as well, after so many rather depressing results, is that actually I believe it's a pretty good news that the vast majority of the youngsters in the region and also in Hungary are pro-democracy. And in the Hungarian context, most Hungarian youngsters are really fed up with how democracy is misused in the Hungarian context. So when it comes to the evaluation of the quality of democracy, they are tending to be negative, but when it comes to the institutional settings of a democracy, then they are quite open to that. So I think that from our perspective, the numbers that we saw, I would rather interpret it as a positive one regarding how pro-democracy the attitudes are. Another positive thing that I believe can be used in future and must be used in future campaigns in Central and Eastern Europe is the pro-Europeanness of the youngsters, and it's true for all countries. In the Visegrad regions, in Hungary as well, there is no appetite for Huxit, for Hungary's potential exit of the European Union. It's around 10%, the support for that in this age group, which is from 15 to 29, while at the same time, approximately 2/3 of the youngsters in Hungary still support Hungary's EU membership. And even more importantly, because I believe that this really shows the depth of the pro-European attitudes and orientations in Hungary, is that the EU is considered as a positive reference point from many perspectives, and this is what the study illustrates with many numbers, and especially the economic performance and what the EU can contribute economically and socially to the quality of life to the people is considered as a very positive reference point, and the youngsters give a much more favorable opinion about the European Union than about their national governments in most respects when it comes to the comparison between the two, the EU and the national government. And I believe that this is what guarantees the long-term support for EU membership in these countries, including Hungary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, András. This is really nice that you gave this positive outcome. However, when I read a snapshot of any kind of youth research, it's very interesting to see whether this data that 1/10 of young people are not happy with democracy and actually open to other kind. Is it much or not? I mean, 90% are very ready. They are protecting their like democracy. So we don't really know, if we don't see it in a process, whether this is growing, it's slowing. Maybe it was always like this. So this is why it's very nice to have this as a comparative report, of course. And I think the value of the report comes out that we have comparative data between countries, and of course then you can see differences and maybe some consequences. But we have two persons with us who are the target group of this report. Yes, but I suppose one of the reasons you do this at the Ebert Stiftung, because you want politicians to read it and you want them to do something. So because there was already so much speech about Poland, I'd like to ask Agnieszka first what this report gave you as a surprise. Was it as a surprise or any information you found in it?
Is it working? Yeah.
Does it?
Yeah? Yeah. Thank you first of all for having me here and for presenting such a great and useful practical use report. And let me start with, because we listen to researchers, I'm here as a politician, and I would like to state the obvious that such research, such a report is useful because it is obvious that every political force, every political party, every political group wants and is good to have young people on board and engaged, both in terms of part of their electorate, but also as active members. And I'm saying that because that should go without question that young people are crucial for creating a certain climate around political debate. Young people validate political agendas, so they are important even if, as you said, in numbers they are less significant part of electorate than the older groups. So there is somewhat instrumental motivation to include younger generation into political process. It shouldn't be ignored, or we as politicians shouldn't pretend that it's not also about that. But the true stake is much higher, the true stake of young people engagement. There are some specific features of younger people engagement that are unique and useful also for strengthening the democratic processes. And in countries such as Hungary, but also in Poland, where democracy is threatened, it is especially important. And what was surprising or striking for me from this report is that young people in Poland, unlike in Hungary, act politically mainly when they feel personally threatened by political decisions. So their demand to be included could be or should be recognized as important indicator that something important is going on, that some important values are in danger, or some interests are in danger, that can have broader consequences in society and also in the future. For young Poles, their agendas are usually very honest. They don't care about something that is not worth caring about for themselves. For example, due to one of the most restrictive anti-abortion law, young women in Poland, but also to some extent young male, are very much engaged and interested in fight for the full women's reproductive rights. They are concerned about that because it affects them, but the broader consequences of this status quo are far beyond individualistic. It's, for example, demographic crisis, family planning crisis, increased immigration of young people, which in turn has some other consequences for other aspects of social and economic situation of Poland. So it is good to listen. I think it's good to listen and watch what is triggering young people to act and to form their demands, not only in order to address their needs, but also as to understand what important processes are currently going on. But at the same time, when they act when they are politically threatened, but at the same time, young Poles are not very politically conscious. That was also in your funding. I think that decades-long dominance of neoliberal, technocratic political discourse in Poland stripped young people from complex political alternatives, and their actions and political attitudes are based more on intuitions. They are not politically educated, which means that they know what they want, but they don't know how to be vocal about it in political terms. Hence, this need for young-oriented political parties, political organizations, or social organizations to help them translate their needs into political agenda, to politicize their demands. And this is important also because with this ongoing or dependent depoliticization of young people agenda, they are becoming more and more open for populists and authoritarian narratives. At this point, they are, as you mentioned, they are quite critical towards the state and towards this attempt of stripping of democracy. But it is important to keep them politically active and engaged in order to safeguard them or us before this threat. So I think that the main conclusion for this report is, practical conclusion, is that our task as young-oriented politicians is to find issues important for young people that could be easily translated into political agenda in order to keep them engaged. I think that one very specific issue is the relation between Catholic Church and the state. There is a huge division, generational division between younger Poles and older Poles in regards to that. Young Poles are very interested in dividing state and church, but right now, for now, they are showing that individually. Yeah, I'm finishing. Only by withdrawing from individual religious practices, and not yet as a political demand or agenda. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It's it's very interesting what a Polish politician can see out of the debate. And finally, we also would like to learn from you, Olga, what was your surprise in this report regarding the Czech Republic?
Thank you. Yeah, this is working. Once again, thanks for having me here. Good afternoon, everyone. I am here as a representative of a youth-oriented party that's becoming old. Now, I may look very young, but I am 37. And since 2012, which is the year when I began to be active, my party has grown older, just as I have. Why am I stressing this? Because given the findings and numbers we'll be discussing and we are discussing at the moment, I may be taken as a bit of an example of youth in action, changing with the time in politics. Maybe we'll come to this together, Agnieszka. Just to remind you of an event maybe long forgotten, maybe not. Years ago, there was this so-called Pirate Bay, a website that was taken down, and it was a beginning of Pirate Party movements, which was a generational political agenda based on the freedom of the internet. From that on, this began in Sweden, spread all over the world. From this, my Czech Pirate Party was founded. What's important, what's interesting in comparison to the findings, it was a generational thing, something that was very personal. The need for protecting freedom of the internet, that was very important for the young people, and it translated into a new party that is now, for example, in my country, in the government. So I could confirm the finding that young people tend to be apolitical when it's not their business to care, but once something very important to them is threatened, they can get very, very vocal about it. So that would be one point, that in my country it's probably a little bit different because new parties emerge quite frequently. And new parties also often form new opportunities for the participation of young people. Number two that I would like to remark upon is the fact that since young people mobilize around topics, they don't want to be so much connected to institutions. That's one of the key findings, I think. It's all about what are those crucial topics in the respective country. And one of your findings is attitudes to migration, for example, that differ significantly among those respective countries. I was thinking maybe it's worth mentioning that the Czech Republic youth is different in this respect when it comes to attitudes to LGBTQ people, because when you look at other research or other polls, Czech youth until up to the age of 35 is in this respect like the Western youth. Our numbers, our support for equal marriage, our support for LGBTQ rights is the same as in Western European countries. I am just saying this because there probably is a strong link to the difference in my country, which is that there is not such a strong influence of the church and of religion in politics. What's striking, though, is that this does not translate to attitudes to migration. I think it's because migration has been misused in my country for years as a political topic to create divide, to have those campaigns dividing between them, threatening us, etc. And maybe the last remark on the finding that might pass away unnoticed, and it's about the age when people become interested in politics, when they go to polls more reliably. And I think it's simply the age of becoming parents, becoming rooted in a place, and it's a moment when people simply need state services, such as kindergarten, schools. They need healthcare more often with small kids, etc. So probably it's not a finding that would relate to this study only, but I think what we should keep in mind is very often young people do not encounter the state that often. They don't have to deal with the state that often. When they're studying, they don't even need to register with some state authorities. However, once they're adults, meaning they need the state, they need government services, they realize maybe the government's not delivering. Now that I am in the position of the one who needs to deliver, I know how hard it is, and I just want to underline this. Once we understand the issues that are crucial to the youth, in my country it's, for example, issues regarding legislation on sexual violence. We don't have modern legislation on, for example, rape. Then it's the youth that takes action. Otherwise, as long as they are not really personally touched or threatened, yeah, they remain usually active within the civil society, within NGOs.
Thank you very much. It's really interesting that you brought up other research input, which is correlating very much of your findings. I would like to ask one short question of all of you, and then we open the floor so you can think about questions. And the first question, I try to be provocative. So, Elena, there were a couple of interesting findings on women on this report. First of all, one statement says that women has much less employment opportunities than men, which was surprising to me. I actually didn't think this, especially in some countries, really big difference. The other one is that women, which we actually know, that women are less interested in politics than men. first question is why. So I actually didn't find many other data on gender differences. So I was lacking a bit some more details about what we know from women and men. So is there a concept or do you think it's do we know enough of the differences, not only political participation, but in general, this report gives a deep enough reference to gender-sensitive data?
Yes, so it's working? Yes. So as I mentioned, socioeconomic issues are really one of the main things young people worry about in this region. And there is high unemployment across regarding youth across all the countries, especially in the Baltics, especially for women. So being at risk of being unemployed if you're a woman in the Baltics is going up to 70%, which is really striking number and quite surprising. We can't answer right now why is that the case. This is like quite surprising finding. But we also find like very interesting and surprising findings with regards to political participation and political interest. So while it's true that men are more interested in politics, they're specifically more interested in specific type of politics, and that is political parties and being part of, let's say, being interested in taking political office, being part of a government. On the other side, young women are more interested in demonstrations. They're more likely to sign a petition, to basically use different newer forms of political participation. So there is maybe something about like men still being interested in the power aspect of politics and women really being more interested in certain changes. And especially, for example, the data on Poland is quite interesting because we see that young women were very much present in the protests that were, with regards to the ban on abortion and also pro-LGBT movement protests, whereas young men were somehow leaning towards more like right-wing protests and so on. So there is something here, yes. And there's also something else that is very interesting, that when we ask what young men and women care about, young women would often say we care about equality. And not only gender equality, they also very much care about social equality. Whereas young men would say, oh, we want to be independent, to have a good career, to advance in life, and to take political office, to be in power. So it's quite interesting that here, like in 2022, we still have some of those traditional forms of gender differences that are permeating the region at large. Yeah.
So, Agnieszka, what a woman politician has to do with this? It seems to be a leadership question. If women all want to go to demonstration, do the big jobs, and they can take every burden, but they don't want to take, leadership roles and office. So, what you as a woman politician can do with this?
Well, it certainly is a provocative question, since we still, in Poland, even on the democratic opposition side, we still lack women, female leadership, at least in...
and you have the most in Central Europe, the Polish.
Yeah, but you are talking about the percentage MPs in parliament.
You have the most.
And it is growing, and it is growing, but it's still not equal, and the key positions in politics they are still occupied mainly by men. But it is changing. And the demand of that change is getting more and more loud, and it's being raised not only by women, not only by young women, but it is being mainstreamed in many ways, especially after this second wave of protests against the total abortion ban. So this is the protest that we are in the middle of in this process, but we are not yet reached the goal. At the same time, there is I think, stronger, bigger division gender division when it comes to political views. Young women in Poland are much more progressive than young male. We could see that on the streets, whether it's a nationalistic march in November in Poland, which is mainly
the question is how can you exploit this? I mean, if there are these women who they're really value oriented, they are also active. So why cannot then they turn it towards a real change?
Actually, they are. They are. When you once again the example of women's reproductive right. What we see after the many years of continuing protests is that even right-wing political parties are changing slightly their political stance and their agenda. We can see that also in changing the society attitudes. There are research that shows that even voters of Law and Justice, or far-right voters, are shifting slightly, of course, towards more progressive or central agenda. So the work is being done, but it's not necessarily reflected in terms of leaderships, positions, power. This is something that I think is next chapter.
Well, it's definitely a lifelong process. Olga, you wanted to comment on this?
Yeah, I'd love to comment, and I would love to thank Andrea, who is over there, who is a woman from the Czech Republic, and also a very active person in her NGO. And I'm saying this because that's the typical role of women who want to be active in public life in my country. Being taking a specific topic and being very active on this topic. I've been for years in politics now, and I have already been 5 years in the parliament, and I can say that every bigger topic I was successful on was thanks to cooperation with the civil sector, with some NGO focusing on the topic. Why do I say this? Because it's really a gendered issue, women active on a specific area, not really entering politics. One more example on this, in my party, we are very open to anyone, and still we have a significantly lower number of female members than of men. We are trying to tackle those barriers, but it's very difficult when simply the interest is much higher in men to become members. It's not about power, but it's simply about membership. The difference is striking. Only about 26 or 27% are women of members. And we are a centrist liberal party, formed especially by people in their 30s. Probably in my country, in the Czech Republic, the reason is mainly practical, and that is simply the lack of childcare facilities. Once you are a woman and you want to have children, which is the dream of most of my fellow country women, it's very difficult to balance family and career, balance public life, especially if in the beginning it always needs huge investment in time, in energy, sometimes in money. And given this window of opportunity to have family and children, many women just decide against it. I myself have 2 kids, and I can only combine my job with family thanks to being elected to represent Prague, the capital, where the parliament sits. To sum up, we have, I think, this practical barrier, which is still being underestimated, lack of childcare facilities. When we look at countries with higher female representation in business boards, anywhere in positions of importance, there you see good quality childcare from the age of 1.5 years, 2 years of age. Unfortunately, I don't know what's the situation in other countries that were in the research. In my country also, the quality of kindergarten, of childcare from 3 years on, is not so high. There are huge differences, but many, especially educated mothers, really think about spending more time with their children so that they have better opportunities in the future, because not all kindergarten options are of good quality. Just one number, the limit for children from the age of 3 that can be together in one classroom is 28 in my country. In practice, there is usually around 20 kids, but this is the official limit. So it's impossible to pay attention to the little ones once the limit is this high.
Well, definitely it's also the ambition, the encouragement for younger women to turn towards positions, not only in politics, in business, in media, everywhere. And the other is to provide the environment that they can actually manage a family, which is somehow not such a big problem for men. However, it's also a burden on men. Well, thank you very much. András, why are people migrating from their countries? You spoke about Hungary and you mentioned political reasons, but it's not the only thing, right? They're from the whole region, at various level, people are leaving. This is very striking number that in average 25% of young people in this given demographic age are actually intending to move abroad, most probably in the EU, but also in the United States. So that is really very high level. And I could see the report also some economic relevances, so that like the Czech Republic, that's not so severe. But for example, in some of the Baltic countries, which are economically better off, still people are leaving in high numbers. So it's really a huge problem for economics, for demographic, for the futures of this whole region is one of the greatest problems. What's the point when you think can be tackled? You know, what's the kind of inflection point where we really have to intervene, and political elites must see that they have to do something, otherwise we become depopulated by the smartest and the most innovative generation, or part of our young generation.
Yeah, probably then this is the point where the economic and social situation comes in, and how youngsters see their economic prospects in their countries. So it's true that what was mentioned, that compared to the situation of the country, the youngsters see their own perspectives on the long term a little bit better, and they have a much more positive view on that. But it's of course not at all irrelevant in which country they imagine that future. Because when we investigate this, we see that their economic situation is probably the most worrying aspect, especially in Hungary. Low salaries come on top when even long-term concerns are discussed. Also, increasingly housing problems. This is what we see, that this is a major problem. Also, the prospects of having a job which requires the qualification that they have. And this is where I want to jump back on the gender issue, because I have one more aspect to that, which hasn't been discussed so far, because we have some serious problems in the labor market as well. Because what we saw in the results in all V4 countries is that women think it much more likely that they will get a job for which they are overqualified. And this is their personal experience as well, and this is what they fear from the future as well, that they do their education in vain and they will not be able to do a proper job that would be requiring their qualification. Regarding the issues that could be important for young people, because we have touched on it earlier in this discussion, and something that hasn't been mentioned so far is the issue of corruption, which seems to us that in all countries, young people are much more receptive to this issue than older generations. It is surely the case in Hungary, but we saw it in the results of other countries as well. We saw it as a top 3 issue when it comes to the current problems of the country. Then among young people, it comes really, really high. Also, the green commitment from the political parties, I believe, is very important. And on a day which is covering mostly sustainability issues here at the Budapest Forum, I think it must be mentioned that besides the materialistic concerns, what is also striking is how important some post-materialistic issues became for the youngsters, and climate change comes on the top among these post-materialistic issues. So these are issues that I think that the more progressive forces in all countries could exploit a little bit more.
Thank you very much. It's the time to open the floor, so any of you who have questions, raise your hand, and I'm very happy to give you the microphone. Is there anyone? Okay. Yes. Yes, it's here. Okay, you come next.
Hi.
Could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, Kamil Jarończyk from Visegrad Insight. I thank you for the panel. It's very interesting. Something that I felt hasn't been addressed yet, especially in the Czech Republic and in Poland. This is an issue that younger voters are swinging, of course, to the left, but also to the right, to the far right in a lot of cases. These straight young men. So how does it look? Why do you believe that a lot of young voters are going, to the far right? And how do you bring people back from that, or is that even a strategy that's worth pursuing? Thank you very much.
Do they go to the right, the young people?
I just wanted to say that I don't think that's the case for the Czech Republic. They are very centrist, the youth. They only get radicalized in those margin of 10% of anti-democratic percentage.
Elena, maybe you can reply.
Yeah, so they are very centrist. The results from our survey show that they are like mostly centrist, except for Poland, where 1/3 of young people actually identify with left parties. So there is some hope there. In Poland, yeah.
And in Hungary, this is more like a past experience, because when Jobbik made its breakthrough in the early 2010s, then actually Jobbik had the highest support among the youngsters, because by that time it was the most evident choice for a youngster who wanted to choose a new party. But since then we have had another parties that could attract potentially young people. Momentum, a liberal centrist party, is being one of them that came to the Hungarian political scene 5 years ago.
Okay, so we have a question here, and then you with the glasses. Thank you. Can you just stand up? We can hear you and see you better.
Okay, thank you. I have a very short question, and this will be a hypothetical question. So what if the discussed countries, lots of young people start to show interest in politics? Could they able to achieve any change, for example, this Hungarian deformed system?
Well, if all young people would be active, could they make a difference?
In Hungary? Then
well, the question was specific.
Hungary or
Let's talk about Hungary. That's the most complicated.
At least this was the hope of the Hungarian opposition this spring, that if the Hungarian youngsters would turn up in big numbers, then they could prevent the Fidesz government winning big again, and something that didn't really materialize. One example when the appearance of youngsters proved to be already decisive was actually the primary elections that was held by the opposition last autumn. Then it was considered that at an election where 800,000 people participated, which was a lot in a country of 10 million, just for a primary of the opposition, approximately 200,000 new voters appeared for the second round of the primaries, and this proved to be vital for a surprise rise of of an anti-corruption candidate, by the way, who failed in the end, but that's another story, and it was a story of 6 months later. But during the primary elections, it showed that something which offered novelty, something which what offered anti-corruption and the renewal of politics was something that was needed by the young voters. So in theory, I would say yes. If in Hungary the young voters would turn up in much bigger numbers, then first of all, it would mean that the political parties and the leading political parties should address this issue and should come up with political campaigns that offer more answers to the concerns of the young people. Because how I see the Hungarian political campaigns is that they are more tailor-made towards pensioners, they are more tailor-made towards those segments of the society who come and participate in much bigger numbers, and then the key issues of the youngsters are addressed much less. So this would be clearly one effect what would be materialized if the youngsters would appear in bigger numbers. And of course, if the youngsters would participate in elections in bigger numbers, it would also mean that most probably Viktor Orbán couldn't win this big. Probably a 2/3 majority would have been avoidable. But of course, in a much tighter race, they could even make the difference. This was originally the hope of the Hungarian opposition, which didn't materialize.
Could you hold for a second, please? Because I will not forget you, and please don't forget your question. But I'd like to have a follow-up question on this, because there was a couple of very interesting data in this report on young people's political participation. And one thing was that 3-4% of all of them are active in politics. 30-40% have never ever talks about politics. Not even at home, not even with friends, never. Basically completely live out of politics. Many of them say that they feel they are completely unprepared. They just don't know of anything of politics. There is also a data in this report which shows that those people, those young people who speak about politics at home and with friends, they are getting to be more active, and they also vote more actively. Yesterday, we had a panel where Mathieu Lefebvre from More in Common was speaking about, and he mentioned a report from various European countries, and what they see, there is a pattern that approximately 1/3 of each society, wherever we are, feel left behind, who always feel that no political elite ever speaks to them. And we also know this from your report, that most of young people feel that the politics doesn't talk to them. So I see here an incredible window of opportunity for politicians. There is 1/3 of each of our population, a significant part young people who feel left behind, who feel their stories are never told. And of course, what your question, not only young people, but no one really is active if there is some political leadership, right? So it's political leaders who have to mobilize young people to do something and to feel involved. So I'm now turning to our two politicians, whether you have a language to young people. Olga and then Agnieszka.
If I may, this is exactly the question we are asking ourselves in my party, and probably all other parties are asking this, because once you get in, like with the Pirate Party, we used to be the cool party with a strange name and a leader with dreadlocks, which he still has dreadlocks, but he's over 40. So not young anymore. And that's what happens with time. You only speak to the youth when you are young yourself, and then later on you may be like acceptable.
But why is that? I mean, they are there. No one is talking to them. There is a potential. They will be the future voters.
I am just trying to make the point of language. I'm a linguist myself originally, and language of the youth is always highly different from the language of people 10 years older. It's a striking thing. It really is a question of culture, also the way we dress, and the way people approach those who are established in the system. And I mean, no matter how important the issues as such are, that for example, just to give you an example how we approached as a political party the youth, we did a poll, we identified the topics that were important to the youth, we did a specific targeted campaign at university students, at those aged 18 to 26, 27, because those were specific topics. So we tailored the campaign. It did work, but still, the only thing that really worked was connecting it to a face of someone who is 22 to 24. And it's something that just everybody needs, seeing someone like him, like himself, herself, in politics. Everybody needs being represented in Czech politics, and I'm afraid it's the same for all the discussed countries. Politics is pretty homogeneous, and minorities are not represented, women are not represented, and young people are not so well represented as a group. And so for me, originally, a person who could represent this age group, I am realizing I am not their representative anymore to that extent as I used to be. And it's simply time.
You need more young people in your party. So Agnieszka.
Well, I would both agree and slightly disagree with you, and because of course representation matters, and it is important to include as many young people in our parties, in our electoral list as it is possible, because there are certain aspects of connection, of dialogue with the younger generation that is unreachable for the older politician. But at the same time, I don't really feel that we should resign from attempt to come into the dialogue with the younger generation just because we're getting older. For example, and it is an anecdota, one of the most popular women politicians from my party on TikTok, which is obviously the medium for the very young generation, is over 60. And she is fantastic with them. She talks about education, about students' rights, about women's rights, and they love her, and she is an icon, idol for them. So we should try to explore different approaches. And the second thing that I would like to say is that I think that one of the biggest challenge for political parties, for politicians, is to realize that the role of young people in politics is not only quantitative but also qualitative. It's not only about the number of young people that show up at the ballot box, but also how many of them engage in the discussion, in the campaign, in the debate, at their homes with their parents and grandparents, because the ability of younger people to create certain climate of the debate, to shift others towards some ideas is really great. So maybe the first step to engage young people more is to invite them just to the table, to the discussion, and then the second one can be just to pull them stronger to become voters.
It's quite fascinating that there's a debate on the stage, but we must give the floor to this gentleman who is waiting. One sentence.
Because I probably didn't explain properly. For example, what happens in every organization is that people stay. Those who are experienced stay. And what I meant is that simply we must keep in mind making place for new people, including young people. So that was my point I wanted to make.
Okay, so thank you very much for waiting.
Thank you. My name is Tivadar Balázs. I'm a freelancer. And my question is related to women. So for them to be able to find work and also to be able to raise kids, what role do you see in the availability in remote work opportunities, and what do you think a state could do to incentivize to have more remote works for women, for example?
Okay, I just wonder whether there's any more question. Okay, if not, then who would like to speak about that? Olga, ready? Good.
Thank you for the question. It's again the practicality that in the end defines the matter. In my country, unfortunately, part-time jobs and home office is not that widely spread. Of course, COVID did help. It showed that in this respect, it did not help in general, but it opened the window of opportunity for showing that home office works for both sides in some job areas. But unfortunately, part-time jobs are simply very underrepresented in our labor market. So, for example, we have only recently passed a law supporting part-time jobs, and we hope that this will encourage more employers and more women to take advantage of that.
Actually, part-time job is a double sword edge, right? So first it helps families and women so that they can go to the school in the morning and in the afternoon, be at home on time. But what about men? So those women who are doing that make half of the salary. They are already underpaid. And, higher status work need more presence. So this also limits women's progress in work. So I am very skeptical, but that was my contribution. And Dalma would like to ask a question. No, don't go to discussion with him, please. So if you have question thank you very much, because I know her and I know she knows a lot about this. So, but I would like to give a final round to our speakers.
I have only one very short question. How much concern the young generation in your countries about the war and the increasing militarization in Poland, Czech, Hungary, etc. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, our time is almost over. I would like to give all of you the floor for whatever kind of final remarks you would like to make. Someone should definitely answer. Maybe you don't all answer the war issue, but if you have some kind of final comment, it would be very nice from all of you. So who would like to start? Olga. Yes, wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you for the for the very topical question. In my country, the general support for Ukraine is very high, and I think it's the same for Poland. And the level of solidarity is actually in stark contrast to the findings of the study, of the analysis with respect to migration. With this, I want to say that with specific situations, societies react differently, and here in this case, I think the youth is on board with the whole society. Very many volunteers, very many helpers, and active young people helping. On the other hand, as a closing remark on the whole of the analysis, we have not had time to discuss the views on education, but it was different for the Baltic states, if I remember correctly. But unfortunately, in my country, in Poland, in Hungary, the relationship, or in Slovakia, the assessment of the quality of education is, let's say, mixed, right? And unfortunately, that's also the reality. My experience is that only a certain percentage of our secondary schools is of good quality, and there's a certain percentage that's of very low quality. And then it unfortunately translates also into attitudes to democracy. So this would be my final remark. Let's not forget, it's also about what level of education, what quality of education the state provides.
Thank you.
I believe that there is no contradiction with what the results say about attitudes towards migration, which meant something different last year when we were asking these questions, because it was relating mostly to the Muslims. and we also measure the attitudes to the Muslim people as well. And what we see in Hungary as well is that this year the attitudes are quite different to the refugees coming from Ukraine as well, partly because many Hungarians, I believe, have thought from the beginning that some of the refugees are actually ethnic Hungarians, so this is a completely different thing, but they also believe that culturally Ukrainians are not that far from the Hungarians as people from Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria, for example. But surely one of the long-term effects of the Hungarian government's anti-immigration campaign is the extremely high number of young people who say that they wouldn't like to see a Muslim neighbor in their homes or in the neighborhood where they live, while at the same time it seems that for the youngsters LGBT is less and less a problem. So this is what we found in this research, and it's true for, I believe, almost all of the countries, and certainly for Hungary, that while anti-Muslim sentiments go strong, and also anti-Roma sentiments, we haven't touched on this dimension, but this is so well embedded into the Hungarian society that still the numbers are strikingly high when it comes to anti-Roma sentiments, but at the same time, anti-LGBT sentiments, I wouldn't say that it's a non-issue for youngsters, but it's much less as an issue than for older segments of the society, which is also promising for the future.
Agnieszka.
Well, to answer your question, I don't really know the numbers, the data of how strong support for Ukraine is in the younger generation, but well, seeing how many of young people were engaged or is engaged in this mass movement of helping Ukrainian refugees, how many of them was involved in NGOs or just grassroots movements, I suppose it is very strong. At the same time, I believe that the fear that the war would expand beyond the current area is lower among younger people than in older generation, which is understandable because the general Polish fear towards Russia is something that is specific rather to older generation. And one last remark about what is extremely important issue and topic for young people in Poland, and I think in Hungary, or maybe I don't remember that correctly, is the issue of housing crisis, of lack of affordable housing. A lot of young Poles are still living with their families, not because of the choice, but just necessity. So this is also generational thing that is hard to understand for the older generation of Poles. So this is yet another example of issue that should be politicized for younger people.
Thank you very much. Elena.
Yeah, so I started the discussion with sharing a few negative key findings, and I want to end the discussion with sharing a few positive key findings, especially on gender equality, because we discussed this topic at length. So we made a few comparisons between the countries, and that was very interesting. However, when we look across time, so if you compare this study with previous studies done over the past few years, we can really see that there has been a positive shift in the way young people are acceptant of LGBT rights, abortion, and more positive attitudes toward gender equality. So while we are not there yet, it's also important to underline that there has been a positive shift across time.
Really great. Thank you for the very positive note, especially that the report is also comparing this region to the Baltics, which seem to be more modern societies in every possible indicators. But we are also progressing, right, here in Central Europe. However, we seem to be more traditional societies compared to the Baltics. This was really very nice. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for all your really nice and good questions. And I think that whatever this report has as negative sign or what we evaluate as some worrying facts, this always should encourage us to improve things, then change, right? And of course, the positive things are good basis for future action and hope. So thank you very much for staying with us, and for you, Agnieszka, Olga, András, and Elena, for your stay and contributions. Thank you very much.